It's my privilege tonight to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Gareth Evans, on the topic of war, peace and national identity. Professor Evans has been Chancellor of the Australian National University since January 2010 and a Professorial Fellow at the University of Melbourne since July 2009. He is President Emeritus of the Brussels-based International Crisis Group, the independent global conflict prevention and resolution organisation, which he led from 2000 till 2009. Professor Evans is familiar to many of us for his 21 years of service in Australian politics, including a long stint as Foreign Minister. In politics, he was known nationally for major undertakings such as his work on native title legislation, and he was known internationally for such roles as developing the United Nations Peace Plan for Cambodia. Since leaving domestic politics, Professor Evans has been associated with numerous United Nations committees. He has co-chaired 2 major international commissions, one on intervention and state sovereignty, and one on nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. He is co-chair of the International Advisory Board of the Global Centre for the Responsibility to Protect. In 2010, he was awarded the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Stitching Four Freedoms Award for Freedom from Fear, in recognition of his work, particularly in developing the concept of the responsibility to protect. Professor Evans has written prolifically on foreign relations, human rights, and legal and constitutional reform. I am confident he will forgive me for claiming him, despite his international reputation, as one of the University of Melbourne's own. He was a student politician, and a young academic here in the law school. In fact, he taught me constitutional law, something of a prerequisite in my present line of work. However, that was all a long time ago. As an observer of his decades of service to both the Australian and the international community, I can say a steady motif in his life has been his palpable belief in the power of ideas to shape human behaviour and to secure positive change in human affairs. I look forward very much to his reflections on tonight's topic, and I ask you all to join me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you very much, Sue, for that introduction. Generous to the point of being almost over the top. But you really were a pretty brilliant student, as I remember, and doing a pretty brilliant job now as a very distinguished member of our High Court. So it's a very great pleasure and privilege for me to be introduced by you here tonight. Excellencies, Vice-Chancellor, very distinguished sea of guests in the audience, ladies and gentlemen. The sense of national identity is never stronger than when countries are at war with each other, at imminent risk of war, or remembering war. Cultural achievements can, of course, stir national pride, and sporting contests, as we all know, can excite national emotion in memorable ways. But it's war, it's the prospect of war, it's the memory of war that has traditionally shaped and defined that collective national sentiment and sense of self we think of as being at the core of national identity. Even in this mercifully laid-back country of ours, where front porch flagpoles are about as absent as they're omnipresent in the United States, it is the events at Anzac Cove nearly a century ago which more than anything else still seem to capture, not least for the younger generation who flock there in extraordinary numbers now every April, that national sense of what it is to be Australian. And we're not the only country in which a strongly war-forged sense of identity has been based not so much on military triumph as adversity, with resistance and resilience under threat of invasion or under occupation or in the face of military disaster becoming the sustaining national story. In Britain, for example, one really does sense that the dominant source of national pride is not so much the glory days of empire, but the magnificently phlegmatic way in which the country collectively responded to the threat of Nazi invasion. That spirit, which some of you will remember perhaps, was very nicely captured by John Cleese when he suggested a few years ago that, quote, "the English are feeling the pinch in relation to recent terrorist threats and have therefore raised their security level from miffed to peeved." Soon though, he went on, security levels may be raised yet again to irritated or even a bit cross. The English have not been a bit cross since the Blitz in 1940 when the tea supplies nearly ran out. Of course, the link between war and national identity has not always been remotely as benign as in the cases that I've been mentioning. We've learned over and again through the long and horrible history of the 20th century how an overdeveloped sense of national identity, national pride taken to extremes of insensitivity, indifference, and sometimes contempt for the rights of the people of other states and nations, can generate, intensify, and prolong deadly conflict. We've seen it in the tragic catastrophe of World War I, in the terrible havoc wreaked by the aggressors of World War II, in the resistance by major imperial powers to the liberation demands of their former colonies, themselves, of course, driven by a strong sense of national identity, which led to many wars from the 1950s to the 1970s. And we've seen it in the succession of awful wars which have been waged between India and Pakistan, between Israel and its Arab neighbours, Iran and Iraq, and the newly independent countries of the Balkans. We've seen it in the tensions which persist to this day between China, Japan, and Korea, with a memory of wartime occupation atrocities still deeply entrenched, and history wars always close to the surface. And we see it persisting to this day in the intractability of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where it's not so much the issues of border definition and security that are proving the showstoppers for serious endgame negotiation, but rather the identity issues of Jerusalem and refugee return. Knowing all this and knowing as much as we all do now about the capacity of the most ordinary seeming of our fellow citizens to perpetrate the most appalling violence on each other, it's hard to be any kind of optimist in international relations or about anything to do with violent conflict. To make even the most tentative suggestion that things might not be quite as bad as they seem, as I well know after quite a few years of committing that kind of faux pas, will almost invariably be taken, as some of you perhaps heard me say before, almost invariably be taken to be compelling evidence of ignorance, congenital naivete, or outright dementia. Yet, when we look at the history of war between states over the whole period since the end of the Second World War, I'll come back later to the issue of war within states, it's perfectly possible to be at least a partial optimist. As both documented and explained by the very highly respected Human Security Report Project, which is a Canadian-based research institute led by Andrew Mack, who some of you will know's distinguished career included a period in Australia as head of the ANU Peace Research Centre, and on whose work I'll draw for a number of my remarks this evening. According to the work of that centre and the statistics that it's compiled, there's been an unmistakably and unarguably dramatic reduction in both the number and scale of international conflicts since the end of the Second World War. Whereas in the 1950s there were on average just over 6 substantial international conflicts being fought around the world each year, including for this purpose wars of liberation from colonial rule. Since 2000, there's been on average fewer than 1 such war, and over the whole of the period, not a single war has been fought directly between any of the major powers. And the wars that have been fought have become far less deadly, whereas in the 1950s, the average cross-border conflict was killing on the battlefield some 20,000 people a year. That toll dropped to around 6,000 during the 1990s and to around half that again in such wars as have taken place in the last decade. Part of the explanation for that dramatic falling away in the number and intensity of conflicts has been the end, essentially by the mid-70s, of those anti-colonial wars, which were a majority, substantial majority of all the wars fought in the 50s and 60s. But more generally, and especially to account for the complete and almost unprecedented absence of conflict between the major powers, there's three quite distinct theories have been advanced. The first is the realist explanation, peace through strength, with Exhibit 1 being the presence on the scene of nuclear weapons since 1945. Argument, I guess, will continue forever about whether the capacity to destroy each other really was decisive in preventing war between East and West during the Cold War years. Argument will continue as to whether it has been or will continue to be in the extraordinarily volatile relationship between India and Pakistan. And for that matter, even as to whether the US bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as distinct from the Russian entry into the war against Japan at the same time, really was decisive in forcing Tokyo's capitulation. What is certainly clear is that US nuclear weapons played no role at all in preventing either the Korean or Vietnam wars, that Soviet nuclear weapons didn't stop the Afghan Mujahideen from attacking and ultimately defeating its army. Israel's nuclear arsenal did not deter Egypt's attack in 1973. And no serious analyst anywhere these days, starting with the US realist Gang of Four, so-called, Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, William Perry, Sam Nunn, whose views have been extraordinarily influential in generating a new international disarmament debate in recent years. No one believes that nuclear weapons are rationally usable by anyone these days. The second explanation is the liberal one of peace through democratization and interdependence. This is not tremendously plausible on the subject of democratization, the security impact of democratization, which certainly hasn't stopped democracies fighting non-democracies, and it certainly hasn't stopped countries in transition to democracy going through some terrible upheavals. What is a little bit more plausible is the argument that peace has largely been secured as a result of the ever-growing interdependencies associated with today's ever more globalised economy. While there's always the awful historical warning in this respect of Europe before World War I, which also believed its countries to be far too interdependent for any war between them to be thinkable, the days of any major player even thinking of seizing raw materials through invasion rather than buying them on the open market really do seem to be long over. And the mutual bondage of the United States and China through debt on the one hand, consumer exports on the other, will, I think, be an immense inhibitor to outright confrontation between them for the foreseeable future. But in many ways, the most compelling of all the explanations for the almost complete disappearance of international war in the contemporary era is a third explanation, that of peace through ideas. A comprehensive shift in both public and elite attitudes toward the legitimacy and acceptability of war as an instrument of statecraft. What was once seen as an almost inevitable concomitant of international relations is now, in the aftermath of the almost indescribable scale of death and destruction in the two world wars, in which ordinary civilians have been targeted, suffered as victims far more than in any previous century. War, as a result of this, I think, is almost now seen universally as something to be avoided at almost any cost. For present purposes, I think what's most interesting is the almost complete evaporation we can witness of any general disposition to glorify military achievement as a critical component of national pride and sense of national identity. Yes, there have been occasional counterexamples in recent memory, one case being Serbian military-focused nationalism, which has been a long time a-dying in the Balkans. But the extreme jingoistic passion for waging war that characterised so many countries' narratives in the first half of the last century and earlier, that just seems to have almost completely disappeared. And maybe, just maybe, that's not just because current generations of policymakers and the publics on whom most of them depend to stay in power believe that war would be too dangerous now for national survival or too destructive to national prosperity. But maybe, just maybe, it's rather because they genuinely believe that there is something about our larger identity, our membership of the larger global community, or more simply, just our common humanity, which makes aggressive warfighting and the glorification of war morally intolerable. I suspect that for all those Australian youngsters visiting Gallipoli in their thousands each April, the message that they have been overwhelmingly taking away and will continue has much less to do with the glory or excitement of war than with its assault on our common human identity. Of course they can't help but come away feeling proud to be Australian, because so many of the characteristics of bravery and resourcefulness and mateship we like to think are part of our national character are so much part of the Gallipoli story. But I think they can't also help but be deeply touched by those words of Kemal Ataturk inscribed on the monument at Anzac Cove. Just about the most moving words ever penned in any language. They go to the absolute heart of the notion of our shared human identity. Most of you will know them. There's no difference between your Johnnies and our Mehmets. To us, where they lie side by side here in this country of ours. You, the mothers who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now lying in our bosom and are in peace. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well. It's almost as moving as that Marseillaise scene in Casablanca, which I shed tears of the 35th time that I've seen it, but there it is. I don't want to overdo the optimism. That'd be crazy. The Caucasus is fraught with continuing explosive cross-border tensions with strong underlying identity dimensions. The Horn of Africa, similarly. The Israeli-Palestinian situation is, unhappily, as far from resolution as ever. In the case of China, too, still harbouring a very real sense of national humiliation at its treatment for 2 centuries by the Western powers. Perhaps we're overstating, although personally I don't believe so, its capacity and willingness to show real restraint, as now its economic power and sometime in the future its military power grows to the point of challenging United States primacy. Of more immediate concern is the case of India and Pakistan, each with their own fiercely nationalistic constituencies. Anyone who believes that totally rational calculation is going to ensure that a future crisis is going to be sustained, maintained, contained within manageable bounds hasn't been concentrating. I had my own sense of this visiting Delhi and Islamabad a few weeks after the terrible Mumbai terrorist attack in 2008, wearing my hat then as president of the International Crisis Group. In both capitals, the tension was such that you really could cut the air with a knife. I met with a group of senior foreign affairs and defence officials in the Pakistan capital and asked them how, given that, how anyone could be sure that with a further provocation of the kind that could occur at any time, the situation would not escalate into nuclear confrontation. The response was, well, not to worry. There are hotlines in place between the most senior government and military figures in each country, and that would ensure that no catastrophic misunderstandings or miscalculations occurred. We're conscious of the stakes and obviously wouldn't let that happen. A few minutes later, walking out to the car, a relatively junior official tugged at my sleeve and said very quietly, "Perhaps I should just let you know that despite what you've heard in there, and although this situation between us has been at boiling point, as everyone knows, for the last 6 weeks, those hotlines have not actually been touched." And I think this is the kind of problem that we're dealing with. You can create formal institutional safeguards, purported mechanisms, but systems and human error and human emotion keep on intruding. In this context, I have to say that in the contemporary era, it is nuclear weapons that do constitute the single most dangerous manifestation of national pride and national identity anxieties taking a military form. Status, far more than security, what I've been indelicate enough in the past to often describe as the testosterone factor, explains at least the United Kingdom, French and Indian bombs. Probably Moscow's as well to a significant extent. London and Paris originally saw nuclear weapons as coming with the territory of their permanent Security Council membership, and now believe them, particularly in the case of France, that to surrender them would be to concede that they are less than central global players. In the case of India, although China's potential enmity was always the stated reason, it's really quite hard to believe that a desire to be seen to be playing in the top league was anything other than the major motivation. Why else, knowing that Pakistan was bound to immediately follow its example, would India have surrendered the huge advantage it had in conventional weapons terms over its Western neighbour? And there is now unquestionably a national pride dimension in Russia's determination to remain, alongside the United States, a major nuclear player so long as nuclear weapons exist. The trouble with nuclear weapons is that although there has been, since the end of the Cold War, an extraordinary degree of both political and public complacency about the risks associated with them, the dangers of their use, by miscalculation or misadventure, if not deliberate design, are nothing less than enormous and a very real threat to the survival of this planet as we know it. Knowing what we know now, not only about the destructive capability of the world's present 23,000 nuclear weapons, equivalent to 150,000 Hiroshima bomb blasts, but knowing what we know about how close, how many times we came really to catastrophe during the Cold War years through human error, through system error, even with the supposedly super sophisticated command and control systems operated by the two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the US. Knowing what we know now about the very much less sophisticated systems of some of the other 7 present nuclear weapons possessing states, and knowing what we know now about the risk of diversion of fissile material and other nuclear hardware to rogue states and terrorists, it really is sheer dumb luck, nothing else, that we've managed to avoid blowing ourselves up over the last 66 years. Nothing to do with the sophisticated brilliance of the systems that are out there, nothing to do with the quality of the statesmanship, sheer dumb luck. And it would be quite crazy to believe that that luck can continue for decades more. So there's no more important priority, I think, on the international security agenda right now than delegitimizing nuclear weapons, reducing their role, their salience in military doctrine to reflect the reality of their unusability, and reducing their appeal to national pride, to national identity, dramatically reducing their numbers and ultimately eliminating them. While numbers of wars between states dramatically declined, as I've described during the Cold War years, at least from the 1960s onward, the same was not true for war and mass violence occurring within states. The number of intrastate or civil wars rose inexorably throughout the Cold War years, and then reached a new peak to just over 50 such confrontations involving 25 or more battle deaths a year In the early 1960s, in the immediate aftermath of the breakup of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, and in the general context of the new political dynamics created by the collapse of Soviet influence. In many parts of Africa, Asia, Europe, and Latin America, there was death, destruction, displacement, immiserization, often on a horrific scale. To look for any single overarching cause for all these conflicts and the major episodes of state and group-inflicted violence is, I think, to chase a will-o'-the-wisp. Big theories, whether they're cast in terms of clash of civilizations or ancient tribal enmity or economic greed or grievance or anything else, may be good for keynote speeches, certainly good for academic royalties, but they never seem to work very well in sorting between those situations which are combustible and those which are not. Every conflict is context-specific, and every risk situation can involve multiple factors: political, economic, cultural, personal. All that said, I know very well from my work over a full decade at the International Crisis Group, which has produced hundreds of detailed, highly detailed case-by-case analyses, that identity issues have been major drivers of a great many civil conflicts and episodes of mass violence. Sometimes it's a matter of national identity, of a kind effectively indistinguishable from that which we've been discussing in the case of war between states, with a clearly identifiable national grouping within a sovereign state, or, as in the case of the Palestinians, under occupation by a sovereign state, demanding a separate legal existence. Or, as again in this context, the Bangladeshis within the original Pakistan, the South Sudanese, this right now, the East Timorese after their annexation by Indonesia, and less successfully those seeking to sever Northern Ireland from the UK or Kashmir from both India and Pakistan. Very often it's a matter of ethnic, linguistic, religious, or regional identity, which can sometimes take also an independence-seeking nationalist form as well, but more often involves groups self-defined by one or more of these characteristics, seeking recognition and redress within the framework of a sovereign state to resolve their long-standing grievances or aspirations. As, for example, with the Acehnese in Indonesia, the Tamils in Sri Lanka, the Darfuris in Sudan, the Hutus in Rwanda and Burundi, the Madhesis of Nepal, the Tibetans and the Uyghurs in China, among many others. Occasionally, the identity issue is completely different again, involving class or ideology, factors which drove some of the most murderous excesses of Stalin and Mao against their own people, and in more recent decades, those of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia in the 1970s. We always think of Cambodia with the outright murder or killing by starvation and disease of some 2 million people, a quarter of the country's population. We think of it as one of the worst genocides of modern times. But in fact, legally speaking, it wasn't a genocide at all within the meaning of the Genocide Convention, because those perpetrating the horror didn't seek to destroy their victims on the basis of their nationality, race, ethnicity, or religion, as the Convention requires, but rather their class, as defined by their education or profession. Both the killers and the killed were of exactly the same race, ethnicity, religion, nationality. It would be a tall order to completely eliminate identity-driven, deadly civil conflict from the face of the earth. It may be that the kind of extreme ideological class-driven pathologies that we associate with Stalin and Mao and Pol Pot won't readily gain a toehold again in the kind of world we now live in. But we do know that very strong sentiments of national, ethnic, religious, linguistic, regional identity do exist in every corner of the globe and will be with us for a long time yet to come. The issue is whether the world is going to be forever condemned to seeing those identity sentiments taking a violent form, or whether identity grievances and aspirations can be satisfied by other means, choosing peace, rather than war. Here again, the news is better than most people think. Since the early 1990s, despite all the terrible cases we can all remember and all the terrible cases still ongoing in the Congo and elsewhere, there has been an extraordinary decrease in the number of civil wars, the number of episodes of mass killing, and the number of people dying violent battle deaths. In the case of serious conflicts, defined as those with 1,000 or more reported battle deaths in a year, and in the case of mass killings, there's been a really quite extraordinary 80% decline since the early 1990s. Although a number of significant new conflicts did commence during that period, and a number of successfully concluded conflicts did break out again within a few years, although less so recently than in the 1990s, many more conflicts have stopped than new ones have started. There's been an even more striking decrease in the number of battle deaths, whereas most years from the 1940s right through to the 1990s had over 100,000 such reported deaths each year, and sometimes as many as 500,000. On top of that, of course, all the civilian casualties from malnutrition and disease as well. The average for the first years of this century, all wars put together, has been fewer than 20,000. Even more encouraging, I think, is the analysis which lies behind these figures. The dramatic decline in wars and battle deaths is partly explained by the end of the Cold War, which, although its immediate result was more conflict rather than less in the Balkans and elsewhere, it did mean that there were no more proxy wars being fueled by Washington and Moscow, and it did mean a more or less complete end to the long era of internal communist insurgency. But the best explanation of this dramatic decline in internal conflict is simply the massive increase in international activism across the whole spectrum of conflict prevention, conflict management, post-conflict, post-crisis, peace-building activity that has occurred over the last decade and a half, with most of this being spearheaded by the still much maligned United Nations. Many more conflicts, as I just said, have been negotiated to conclusion than have newly erupted. There's been a tenfold increase from 1991 to 2007 in the number of Friends of the Secretary-General groups, contact groups, and other political arrangements that support peacemaking and follow-on initiatives, as well as a threefold increase in the number of peace operations overall, with more than 30 now underway around the world. There's been a ninefold increase from 1989 to 2008 in the number of post-conflict operations specifically focusing on disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. And beyond the UN, significant roles of their own have been played by a number of regional organizations, notably in Africa, by many individual states through their own diplomatic and peacekeeping activity and targeted development assistance, with Australia, I have to say, playing a leading and honourable role in this respect under successive governments. And literally the contribution as well of thousands of NGOs, including, I hope, my own international crisis group, which simply didn't exist before 1995. On top of all this classic conflict prevention and resolution activity, we've seen the emergence over the last decade of a new international determination to address the intractable problem of mass atrocity crimes, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and other major crimes against humanity, war crimes, sometimes occurring in the context of civil war, but as often as not with a dynamic of their own. For centuries, right up to the beginning of our own 21st century, mass atrocity crimes of this kind, perpetrated behind state borders, were seen as essentially nobody else's business. As the tragedies we can all remember in the 1990s unfolded, with the lowest points being Rwanda, 94, Srebrenica, 95, Kosovo, the absence of consensus in the Security Council, 99, there was not even the beginning through those years of North-South consensus around the notion of a right of humanitarian intervention, much enthusiastically proclaimed by the global North, but deeply, passionately resisted by the global South. But now, with the acceptance by the global community of the new principle of the responsibility to protect, unanimously embraced by heads of government and state in 2005, and overwhelmingly embraced subsequently in quite hard-fought UN General Assembly debates since then, there has been a profound normative shift. While there's still plenty of room for disagreement as to what the proper institutional, international response should be in each individual mass atrocity case as it emerges, and in particular, there's bound to be disagreement about the precise circumstances in which last resort coercive military power action should apply, the sea change over the last 5 or 6 years has been that these are now regarded as cases which simply cannot be ignored. They are no longer nobody's business, but everybody's business. The course of action taken by the Security Council in response to the events in Libya and the parallel action in Côte d'Ivoire has given extraordinary new momentum and authority to the new responsibility to protect norm, starting, as the Council did, modestly with warnings, targeted sanctions, but then moving with absolutely extraordinary and unprecedented rapidity to authorise direct military action as it became evident to everyone, or at least everyone but John Pilger and Noam Chomsky, that this was the only way further civilian massacres could be avoided. As someone who's fought personally very long and hard to develop and implement the responsibility to protect concept, in the hope that we would never again have to say never again in the aftermath of a Cambodia or a Rwanda or, God forbid, a Holocaust, I do share the anxiety that the present Security Council civilian protection mandate in Libya not be stretched to breaking point by the current NATO operation. Should Libya, far from setting a new benchmark for future commitment in extreme cases, prove to be the high water mark from which the tide now recedes, that I think would be an absolute tragedy, given the extraordinary progress that's been made. Much work really does remain to be done to ensure that we not only hold the line that's been won here, but make the responsibility to protect in all its dimensions, preventive as well as reactive, ever more effective. But on this, as on most of the great issues of war and peace and human security and human dignity with which the international community is wrestling, I remain an eternal optimist. Having strong senses of identity with one's nation and multiple other groups is an inherent part of what it is to be human. We can't and shouldn't even try to erode those senses of identity. But we should do everything in our power and our competence in all the ways that each of us find possible, professionally and personally, to emphasise not the things that divide us, but our common humanity, and to continue to find institutional and political ways of ensuring that as people follow their identity dreams, and as people try to redress the injustices that their national, ethnic, religious, or other identity may have caused them to suffer, that struggle will not take a violent form. On the evidence that I see in the world around me, that job is far from done, but I think we're gradually succeeding. And I hope that in what I've said this evening, I've given you at least some ground for sharing my optimism. Thank you.
Professor Evans is only too happy to receive questions from the audience, so I invite you to put your hands up. Yes? About halfway along. Step aside when you answer.
You mentioned the
Could
testosterone...
you introduce yourselves?
Oh, sorry, my name's Catherine Ellis.
Hi.
You mentioned the testosterone factor, and so I was a little bit surprised that you didn't actually talk about how the influence of the growing enfranchisement of women through the 20th century may have affected peace. And as well as that, perhaps the growth of television and the media and the ability to bring war into our homes and how that may have affected people's aversion to it. Could you comment on those?
Well, I think the extent to which the horror of war now impacts very directly through television and other media directly in people's homes, and the way so often that story has been told in terms of gender violence and all the horrors of war that are associated with that, for women in particular, I think that has been one of the very important combinations, two of the factors that have made a difference in creating what I would describe, perhaps optimistically, as a completely different kind of view about the glory or otherwise of war in countries right around the world. There's all sorts of cultural differences which we know all about, and all kinds of degrees of differing sensitivity with which these issues are conveyed and absorbed in different cultural communities and environments. But a common theme, I think, is a much greater appreciation of the sheer unmerciful horror of the conflict experience, particularly for the most vulnerable people in societies. And I think that just has been a very important part of the equation.
Over here, yes, in the red shirt.
Where's the mic? We got one over this side? Or? Speak up, we can hear. Where's the mic? So we better... We only got one?
Here we go.
We better stick to one, so.
My name's David Feith. Professor Evans, the war in Sri Lanka, which went on for a number of decades, ended in 2009 in a very bloody sort of end of the war, and the UN committee that's been investigating has recently come out, I understand, saying that both the Sri Lankan government and the LTT were guilty of war crimes in that, particularly in the last 4 months of the war, when something like 10 to 40,000 civilians were killed. Now, given that the Sri Lankan government has basically said that the report is worthless and they don't think they said it's very biased and they're not prepared to take any consideration, what way forward is there now for the UN and the Security Council, the International Committee generally, on that issue of war crimes in Sri Lanka?
Well, the options are quite limited, but I think naming and shaming and sustained international pressure is really pretty critical to sustain. The Sri Lankan government behaved horribly through a lot of the last period that generated the war to begin with, but also in the end game. I don't think we should underestimate the extent to which the Tamil Tigers under Prabhakaran's leadership also behaved horribly, and that was unfortunately one of the factors that made it such a confusing situation to read for the international community, particularly in the 9/11 context and dealing with terrorism and so on, and given that the Tigers were a deliberately and outrageously terrorist-focused organisation, Sri Lanka was able to play that international harp very well. A lot of people were very confused by the situation, even though they were getting lots of reports from the International Crisis Group saying there's horror on both sides and the principles, responsibility to protect and so on are applicable to this situation. But after the war, the Sri Lankan government did have an opportunity to engage in a major reconciliation exercise with the Tamil people in terms of autonomy arrangements and genuine redress for civil rights and other grievances. It's chosen, very unfortunately, I think, to engage in a very triumphalist brand of nationalist jingoism. And I think it does deserve a lot of international attention, this case, and a lot of international criticism. I don't think we ought to be too romantically inclined about what it was the government was dealing with, but the way in which it dealt with it was absolutely indefensible, and I, for one, feel very strongly about that. But, what the policy options are in this kind of after-the-event situation, it's very difficult to pin down. But I think this is where we do have to use such institutional vehicles, flimsy reeds though they may be, like the Human Rights Council and so on, to just keep the pressure on and make the Sri Lankan government appreciate the unacceptability of the kind of response that we've seen so far.
Whilst we have the microphone here, there's a question just over against the far wall.
Yeah, I'm actually a colleague of Gareth in the School of Social and Political Sciences, and I'm going to ask you a question that's a little bit related to a question I asked you in a different context, but that is wars relating to climate change. There's an increasing concern that in coming decades that climate change may be a reason for wars. Some people have referred to the war in Darfur as the first climate war. And at the same time that George W. Bush was denying the reality of climate change, the Pentagon had commissioned a study of climate change and national security. In the UK, the defense ministry there did a similar study, and I think in the EU, similar study. So what are your thoughts about climate change as a potential source of war in the future?
Well, Hans, you are not, if nothing else, indefatigable in your pursuit of this topic, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to give you exactly the same answer, which is that although climate change is a very real and obvious source of future tension between regions, between countries, over resource limitation issues and changing resource environment overall, not to mention the more dramatic impacts on countries whose borders are potentially going to wash away. It's very, very hard to translate that into any particular conflict prevention strategies in any particular country situation at the moment, because the links are very tenuous in any particular case and the issues are still very ill-defined. So the best possible response to this situation, I think, is to just add it to the pile of very good arguments for doing something quickly and effectively to halt the impact of climate change, and to recognise that if we do have this phenomenon unfolding around us, it's going to have many, many different dimensions, of which the security one will be a very central and important one. So I agree absolutely with you, but it's just that not a hell of a lot follows from it in terms of direct policy prescriptions, except maintaining the rage. So more power to your arm.
We have a question in the middle sector here, up about. Thank you.
Colin Honey, Professor.
Hello.
I wonder if you could
35 years ago, Colin.
Indeed. I wonder if you could say a little more about the responsibility to protect and to whom a mandate to intervene is conveyed. Is it the UN alone who is able to act, or does it provide a justification for the United States to ignore national sovereignty and to take action in other countries, for example?
In short, the responsibility to protect has got three basic pillars to it. One is the responsibility of every sovereign state to act to protect its own people from mass atrocity crimes. The second pillar is the responsibility of every state in the international community to do what it can to assist sovereign states that are in the mood to be assisted, through development aid or military support or whatever, to do just that. But thirdly, the responsibility is to the wider international community to do basically what it takes to act in a timely and decisive fashion, as the resolution says, if a state is manifestly failing to exercise that responsibility to its own people. Now, military options are by far the most sensitive possible policy response, but they're not the only possible response. I mean, when a responsibility to protect situation erupted in a terrible, graphic fashion in Kenya, right at the end of 2007, early 2008, you may remember in the aftermath of the election when there was 30,000 people expelled from the Rift Valley and church burnings were taking place, people being incinerated alive in ways that were reminiscent of Rwanda 14 years earlier. This was characterised in the UN and elsewhere as a responsibility to protect situation, but the response was to have a diplomatic initiative under Kofi Annan's leadership, which without any shots being fired did succeed over a 2 or 3 week period in dampening the fires, getting the senior political leaders to calm the situation down and to stop it. So there's a full repertoire of responses that are available. There's the diplomatic interventions, there's naming and shaming and political isolation, there are targeted economic sanctions, there's the threat of prosecution in the International Criminal Court. All of those things don't necessarily involve military action and don't really involve any policy problems. The policy problem is when a really extreme case arises where it's obvious that nothing else is going to work, like Rwanda in '94 and arguably, I think, Benghazi 2011, where it's pretty clear that all the other strategies are just not going to make an impact. You've got a potential massacre right on your hand. What do you do about it other than military action? But in that context, it's only the Security Council that can authorise military action. There's no provision anywhere else in the international system, other than in situations of self-defence, which don't arise here, for anyone else to act. With one possible exception, and that is under Chapter 8 of the UN Charter, regional organisations do have an authority to intervene, including militarily, provided they come back to the Security Council later and seek authorisation. And that's actually happened in West African contexts a couple of times, and I think increasingly we're going to see that happen. Of course, you can bypass the Security Council if you're minded to do so and do in Iraq in 2003, whatever the justification or lack of it there. But to do so is something that I think can't really be contemplated for countries like us, which have to be supportive of a rule-based international order. So you won't hear me beating the drum for that. So responsibility to protect is a nuanced, multi-layered approach to dealing with these situations preventively and reactively, with the military stuff only being one small part of the total picture. There's a whole bunch of criteria apart from the legal one which should also be applied before you contemplate military action, including not only the gravity of the situation and the proportionality of the response and the intention, whether it's genuinely about dealing with the crisis in human protection terms as distinct from oil or something like that. All these are relevant factors. But another relevant factor is not making the situation worse and not doing more harm than good. And very often in these situations, and Darfur I think is a classic one, any military intervention would have just inflamed and escalated the situation. And I think that's part of the problem in North Africa and the Middle East at the moment. There was regional support from the Arab League for military intervention in Libya, which made that possible. There has not been any similar regional support for that extreme form of response in Syria, let alone Bahrain and elsewhere. And that's looked a bit like a sort of a double standard situation and the imperfect application of this principle. But I think that's just the real world. The important thing is the basic point that I was making, that there's a different kind of intellectual and emotional response to these issues now than was even the case just a decade ago. There's a genuine reflex response out there. For God's sake, we've got to do something. We can't have a Benghazi, we can't have another Rwanda on our collective conscience. And there's always going to be disagreement, as I said. There's always going to be different dynamics at work, disagreement about what the appropriate policy response is. But we've made a hell of a forward step in this respect. And the fact that the US and the West was able to command the majority vote that it did, and let's remember an abstention in these situations is just as good as a majority vote in the UN, then it's really quite remarkable that what happened happened. And I just hope that, as I said, this doesn't evaporate away through overreach by an over-exuberant application of a power that's not formally there.
We have another question, centre front.
No, it was pretty
My
low.
name's John Furness.
Let them go for a while.
There's an undoubted cost of protection, economic, military, in terms of national emotion even. And I think we've seen a disproportionate bearing of that cost by some countries, particularly the United States. We've seen, to some extent, a demilitarisation in Europe. Can there come a point where the cost can't be borne, or where leaders will withdraw and that will see a retrogression of the situation?
We can't pretend that taking seriously these sorts of problems, whether you're talking about conflict generally, war, civil war, or whether you're talking about mass atrocity crimes, you can't pretend this is cost-free. It does require very substantial commitments of aid resources to create the governance and economic conditions which will give you a chance of longer-term stability. And when a situation does explode to the point of requiring a major peacekeeping operation, or even more, a major military intervention operation, it is a costly business. And it's perfectly understandable that the United States should be getting extremely irritated about the lack of support in this respect from a number of its allies, particularly the NATO Europeans, who really have been, I'm sorry if the EU is represented here tonight, but they really have been shocking laggards in this respect and free riders of the worst kind. And, and we just have to recognise that we're all in this together if we are going to forge common responses that really will make a difference in these crisis situations. Then we have to act in a more committed way, and that applies to Australia as well. I think the important way of thinking about this is for states to recognise that when they talk about national interests, and of course they've got to communicate these issues to their own publics in terms of national interest, because charity and moral commitment is not necessarily all that alive and well. Don't just think in terms of the traditional duo of security interests and economic interests. Think in terms of every country in the world these days having a third interest, and that is the interest in being and being seen to be a good international citizen. Because there are so many, what Kofi Annan used to call problems without passports, so many situations from climate change through terrorism, through health pandemics, through refugee outflows, through terrorism, that can only be resolved by international cooperation. And Our priorities won't always be the same as our neighbours' priorities or people over the other side of the world. But over time, if all of us have a common commitment to those global public goods, those collective action things, including peacekeeping, which need to be done to create harmony, sustain harmony in an ever more interdependent world. If you think of it in those terms and communicate to your own populations that, look, the problems that are out there, which we think of not as our own, can come to bite us on the tail, as refugee issues so obviously are perceived as doing, realistically or otherwise, in Australia at the moment. So I think if we can get that mindset change, and I don't want to be partisan about it, but I am disappointed in the way in which the Howard government walked away from that kind of articulation of issues in those terms. The present government is struggling to sort of recreate, I think, some of that concept. But it is something that's much more important be developed on a global scale, because the costs are real, the sacrifices that are going to have to be made by publics around the world to contribute to these common goods are real. And I think that's just part of the deal of living in a common globe.
There's a question over in the far segment.
Bob Phelps.
Two more, okay.
You rather sneeringly dismissed Pilger and Chomsky.
Not sneeringly, I'd say contemptuously, actually.
Contemptuously, that's fine. They addressed the question, of course, that you don't address at all, and that's America, the global power, the global superpower, and its interests. Its interests mainly in oil and selectively propping up dictators in the Middle East and going to war there. Would you take a different stance now if you were on that plane with Ali Alatas carving up East Timorese oil?
No, because as Jose Ramos Horta has readily acknowledged, doing that deal and getting the oil flowing was something that has profoundly benefited the independent East Timor, which inherited exactly the arrangement that was negotiated. In terms of the larger issue about US power, I don't think you'll find me, if you look back over my public career, being a paid-up member of the uncritical cheer squad when it comes to anything that America does is right. On the contrary, there's quite a fierce independence about the way in which we conducted a number of aspects of our foreign policy, and I have some of the bruises still to show it. And also, as recently as a week ago, I was quite strongly arguing in Sydney with a legion of people assembled to discuss the US relationship about the unwisdom of the US continuing to use the language of primacy, of dominance, of domination, militarily and otherwise, in our own region. It's not only counterintuitive in terms of its practical sustainability, it's also counterproductive in terms of its impact. My perception of the way in which the US ought to be using its great and unprecedented power was exactly and beautifully, I think, articulated by Bill Clinton, of all people, 10 years ago, out of office, and people are always a bit more creative out of office than in office, but at a private function, I've often quoted this, and I'll quote it again. I quoted on John Fane today, some of you may have heard me, but it just stuck very, very firmly in my mind, because I think it's exactly right and exactly the way in which the US ought to be addressing the issue of the relationships with China in our own region. What Clinton said was this: in applying its great and unprecedented economic and military power, America has two choices. Choice number one is to use that unprecedented and overwhelming power. It was overwhelming then economically, not quite so overwhelming now, but choice number one is to use that overwhelming economic and military power, which still is, to try to stay, as long as we can, top dog on the global block. Choice number two, which he made clear he preferred, he articulated in these terms, is to use that great and unprecedented power to create a world in which we will be comfortable living when we are no longer top dog on the global block. That seemed to me to just nail it exactly. I think Obama gets it in those terms, whether he can say so quite as explicitly. Again, it's a function of the difficulties of the American political system, like everybody else's political system. But that's really what it's all about. And rather than a sort of a mindlessly reflexive action about oil dominance and ill motivation and all the rest of it, I mean, please do recognise that there are many, many, many people in the US that have a very profound conviction about what it is to be a responsible global power and an absolute determination to put that into the kind of policy practice that we've been seeing during this administration. One more?
One was right.
Sorry, up to you.
Yes, one last question. I think time is running out.
I'm not sure I want to be the last question, really, but anyway. Professor Evans, thank you for joining us in Melbourne for the Festival of Ideas. My name's Jo Hayter. I just have a question around your view in terms of national identity and the power that that brings one way or the other in relation to today's UN Security Council and where you think that may be taking us in future, the significance of national identity on that very important decision-making body.
Well, it's a good question because the UN Security Council is the only executive decision-making body the world has at the moment. There's lots of policy-making bodies and lots of hortatory and declaratory bodies, but the Security Council is the only one that's got the capacity, legally speaking, universal membership and the capacity, at least on paper, to deliver it. So it's critically important that we ensure that the Security Council represents the world as it now is, not the world as it was in the middle of the last century. I've been one of those that's been quite actively involved over about the last 20 years in trying to get some serious consideration of change in composition of the Council with a whole variety of different formulae in play. I think we're stuck for the foreseeable future in terms of a formal addition to the number of permanent members with or without veto power. You've just got the existing 5 that have the capacity to stymie anything that's not to their taste. You've got France and Britain, obviously, desirably now subsumed in a new European entity, absolutely unwilling to go down that particular path. And, you know, it's every which way you look at it, you get stuck. But I think where we'll see a way through this is in terms of a de facto recognition that there are another whole group of states, and we know who they are, 4 or 5, 6 of them may be, who are the big players, the Nigerias, the Indias, Japan still, South Africa perhaps, certainly Brazil, who just have to be there if this is going to be a representative body. And I think what we'll see happening is a recognition of the desirability and a de facto kind of acceptance of them being regularly re-elected to hold the non-permanent seats so that they are sort of permanent fixtures on the scene. Of course, the trouble with gentlemen's agreements of this kind, as Ben Chifley once famously said, is there's not enough bloody gentlemen. But I do think there's such now a recognition that we are all in all this stuff together, that it is important, whether you cast it in identity terms or not, but it is important that the key countries, the key players of the world be represented. The G20, I think, will continue to evolve as a key policy-making body stretching across economic, increasingly into social policy areas, climate and security policy areas more precisely. But it's still absolutely critical in terms of the health and sanity of the global institutional system that you have the Security Council genuinely representative. So, as somebody said, it's a kind of business class solution with the prospect of upgrading to first class in some distant future for these countries. But it's a kind of practical solution that the world on the whole hasn't been bad at formulating when it's recognised a need. And I think what we've seen with the 9/11 decade and so many of these other transnational problems without passports just really assuming a major prominence, and a growing confidence in the capacity of the UN to actually deliver solutions to at least some of these problems, I think we'll actually see that as the way forward. But again, I'm a congenitally naive optimist, and I hope I'll continue to remain so. Thank you.
You've stolen my thunder there, because I was going to do three things. One, apologise to those who didn't get an opportunity to ask a question, because there were quite a few of you. Secondly, I was going to thank all of the interlocutors, because the range and the depth of the questions showed very clearly just how profoundly thought-provoking tonight's speech was. So may I ask you once again to join me in thanking our speaker.